The stage lights beamed down on Elon Musk as he stepped out onto the set of Tonight with Mark Reynolds. The studio was alive with excitement, the energy palpable. The crowd's applause echoed, a mix of admiration and curiosity. Elon, as always, was calm and collected, but tonight, something felt different. He could feel it in the air, the tension, the sense that this would be more than just another interview. "Welcome, Elon," Mark Reynolds, the charismatic host, said with a grin, extending his hand. "It's great to have you here tonight. You've made some waves lately, and everyone's been watching you closely. But tonight, I want to get into some real talk." Elon offered a tight but genuine smile, shaking Mark's hand. "Happy to be here," he replied smoothly, taking his seat. The audience settled down as the lights dimmed slightly, focusing all attention on the two men. Mark Reynolds, with his sharp wit and quick comebacks, was known for getting his guests to open up, sometimes a little too much. "So, let's dive right in," Reynolds said, leaning forward with a playful twinkle in his eye. "You've done so much, Elon. From founding PayPal to launching SpaceX and revolutionizing the car industry with Tesla. But with all the success, you've also faced your fair share of backlash. Critics have come at you from all directions, and some would say you're kind of a lightning rod for controversy. How do you deal with that? I mean, don't you get tired of it all?" Elon paused for a moment, his face betraying no sign of discomfort. His eyes, however, were calculating. "Criticism is just noise," he said simply, his tone cool, almost indifferent. Mark raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. The audience, too, seemed to be holding their breath. "Noise? Interesting. Well, some of that noise has been pretty loud, don't you think? Take the whole Tesla going private fiasco, for example. That tweet you sent out, it was a mess. Do you think you've ever made some questionable decisions?" The atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted. There it was, the direct hit. Mark's words weren't just a probing question, they were a challenge, a way to test Musk, to see if he'd flinch. Elon's expression remained calm, but the tension in the air was now palpable. It felt like something was about to break. "Well, Mark," Musk began slowly, his eyes narrowing just slightly, "what's the point of living if you're just going to play it safe?" The words hung in the air, and for a split second, the room went silent. The audience, sensing the change in tone, leaned forward in their seats. Mark Reynolds didn't expect that. His smile wavered for a moment as he tried to gauge the situation. "Is that your excuse for making impulsive decisions? I mean, it wasn't just the Tesla tweet. You've been known to make some wild moves. What makes you think it's okay to act first and think later?" Elon's lips curled into a slight smile. "I don't act without thinking," he said, voice steady but firm. "I just don't get bogged down by fear. Sometimes, you have to take risks to make progress. And if people don't like it? That's their problem, not mine." The audience sat in stunned silence. It wasn't often that someone would speak so directly, so unapologetically, especially when on the hot seat. Mark Reynolds, the seasoned host, was visibly taken aback. He wasn't expecting this level of confidence, and certainly not this level of confrontation. Elon sat back, his posture relaxed, but his eyes never left Reynolds. There was a subtle power shift happening, one that the audience could feel. The host was no longer in control of the conversation. It was clear that this wasn't going to be just another friendly exchange of words. Mark, trying to recover, chuckled nervously, clearly searching for his next question. "Well, I guess that's one way to look at it. But..." Before he could finish, Elon cut him off, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "If you're afraid of failure, then you're already failing. Life is about trying, learning, and pushing forward. Whether it's the people who love you or the ones who doubt you, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you have to live with your own decisions. The room felt heavy with tension, and the audience, who had been eagerly awaiting this moment, could sense the shift. This wasn't just an interview, it was a confrontation. A clash between a man who had built an empire and a host who thought he could challenge him. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Musk's words, though directed toward the host, now seemed aimed at the audience. He was in control. He knew it. And they knew it too. Mark Reynolds, now recovering from the shock, forced a smile. Well, Elon, it seems like you're not afraid of controversy. But let's dig deeper, what really drives you? But Elon was already stepping into the next phase of the conversation. The audience was ready, and the tension was only going to grow from here. The tension in the studio hung thick in the air. Elon Musk had just taken control of the conversation, and Mark Reynolds, seasoned as he was, could feel the shift. His initial challenge had backfired, and now it was time to regain some ground. So, Elon, Reynolds began, trying to regain his composure, you've built an empire in space, cars, energy, and even trying to revolutionize the brain with Neuralink. But you've also been known to make some impulsive decisions. Some of them have caused a stir, to say the least. Can you see how that might ruffle a few feathers? Elon leaned back in his chair, his gaze still steady, but his expression was unreadable. The way he responded was deliberate, measured, no hint of defensiveness, no unease in his tone. I don't think there's anything wrong with shaking things up. If you want to change the world, you can't be afraid of stepping on some toes. Sometimes, people get uncomfortable with the unknown, but that's how we make progress. Reynolds wasn't about to back down. Sure, but some would say you've pushed the envelope so far that you've caused more damage than good. I mean, think about the PR nightmare with Tesla's production delays, or the firestorm that came after your controversial comments about COVID-19. Doesn't it make you wonder if you're sometimes too reckless? A flicker of something darker crossed Elon's eyes, but his demeanor remained calm, almost cold. Reckless? Elon repeated, his voice dropping just enough to let the weight of his words land. Reckless is not taking action because you're afraid of what people will say. If I only did what was safe, we wouldn't have SpaceX. Tesla would have never made it past its first prototype. And the Boring Company? It wouldn't even exist. Reynolds' eyebrows furrowed. But that's the thing, isn't it, Elon? You've got this trail of controversies that follow you. The stock price crashes, the lawsuits, the Twitter tirades, sometimes it feels like you're a walking PR disaster. How do you justify that? A faint smirk appeared on Musk's face. He wasn't rattled, if anything, he seemed almost entertained. Maybe it's easier to look at the mess than it is to look at the end result. People forget how far we've come. But that's how it always is with pioneers. The noise is louder than the winds. Reynolds, sensing that this wasn't going in the direction he hoped, pressed on. You talk about the end result, but what about the people who follow you? The employees at Tesla, SpaceX, and Neuralink? They have to deal with the fallout of your decisions. How do you balance innovation with responsibility? For the first time that night, there was a pause. Elon's eyes briefly softened, as if considering the weight of the question. The audience could feel the shift in energy, sensing that he was truly reflecting. Of course, people matter, Musk said, his voice lowering slightly. You can't do anything without a good team. But it's not about avoiding mistakes, it's about learning from them and making sure the mission moves forward. Sometimes, you need to get uncomfortable to find the right path. Reynolds leaned forward, sensing an opportunity to stir the pot further. But what about when you don't learn from those mistakes? Some would argue that you've been too stubborn to admit when you're wrong. Like with the way you handled the SEC investigation. You didn't exactly make a lot of friends there. Elon's jaw tightened, just a fraction of an inch. For the briefest moment, the mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of frustration. "I'm not here to make friends, Mark," he said, his voice colder now. "I'm here to make a difference. If people want to tear me down for that, I'll live with it. But I don't back down." There was an unmistakable sharpness to his words now, the kind that cut through the tension in the air. The audience seemed to shift in their seats, sensing a change in the dynamic between the two men. Mark Reynolds, for the first time, seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to keep pushing without making this conversation explode entirely. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. What's your opinion? Should leaders like Elon apologize when they've made mistakes, or should they keep pushing forward? Elon's eyes scanned the audience briefly, his voice taking on a new tone as he spoke directly to them. "What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you take the heat or would you back down?" Reynolds finally managed to recover, leaning back in his chair and giving a wry smile. "You've got some serious conviction, Elon. But, come on, no one's perfect. Do you ever feel like maybe, just maybe, you've taken things a bit too far?" Elon met his gaze squarely, unblinking. "Mark, if you don't push the boundaries, you'll never know what you can truly achieve. I've made mistakes, sure. But those mistakes have led to real progress. And that's all that matters in the end." The room was electric. No one was quite sure if the battle had just begun or if it was already over. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just a talk show. This was an intense philosophical clash of two opposing viewpoints, one grounded in risk and innovation, and the other in caution and reflection. Mark Reynolds, now somewhat subdued, gave a short nod. "Fair enough. Let's shift gears a bit, Elon. We've been talking a lot about the tough stuff, but what about the future? What's next for you?" Elon's smile returned, his eyes glinting with that signature confidence. "The future? It's going to be exciting. But it's going to take more than just good ideas. It's going to take people who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty and take the risks that everyone else is too scared to take." The audience was silent for a moment, processing his words. There was no doubt about it, Elon Musk had just delivered a masterclass in resilience, conviction, and the art of confrontation. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn. Elon Musk had dominated the stage, and the audience could feel the shift in the room. Mark Reynolds, ever the professional, had tried to keep things light-hearted, but it was clear that the evening was shaping up to be something much more intense than anyone had anticipated. Reynolds, ever the quick-witted host, knew that he had to regain control, fast. He took a deep breath, preparing for the next round of questions. "So, Elon," Mark began again, leaning forward with a playful smirk, "you've got this ambitious vision of the future. Colonizing Mars, transforming transportation, revolutionizing energy consumption. But let's face it, not everyone shares your optimism. Some people think you're living in a fantasy world, that your goals are impossible. How do you respond to those critics who say you're just chasing pipe dreams?" Elon's eyes flickered for a moment, but he didn't flinch. The question was familiar, one that he had faced countless times. His reply was swift and unshaken. "The future doesn't exist yet, Mark. It's being built right now. If you don't aim for the stars, how will you ever reach them? If you're not willing to challenge the status quo, nothing ever changes." Mark raised an eyebrow. "That's a nice sentiment, Elon. But don't you ever feel like you're setting yourself up for failure? You're aiming to do things that most people would consider impossible. Like creating a fully sustainable world with renewable energy, or making interplanetary travel a reality. What happens when you hit a wall?" Elon leaned forward, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "When you hit a wall, you either break through it or find a way around it. The real question is, how many people are willing to keep pushing when everything tells them to stop?" The words hit hard. Mark, usually the one steering the conversation with ease, found himself momentarily stunned. It was as if Musk had already anticipated every challenge, every doubt, and had answered it before the words were even spoken. The audience seemed to hold their collective breath. This wasn't just a conversation about space or electric cars anymore. It was a battle of ideologies, a contest of conviction between two very different worldviews. And right now, Elon Musk's worldview was winning. Mark pressed on, his tone a little more forceful. Alright, then, let's talk about the people who follow you. We're all familiar with the rise of Tesla and SpaceX, but there are also people who think your leadership style is too much. Too demanding, too aggressive. You've been called a tyrant by some of your critics. How do you respond to that? Elon paused. This was a question he had been asked before, but tonight, in front of this audience, the implications were heavier. It wasn't just about defending his company's success, it was about defending his personal philosophy. I expect a lot from the people I work with, Elon said, his voice firm. But I also give everything I have to the mission. I don't ask anything from anyone that I'm not willing to do myself. If that makes me demanding, then so be it. We're trying to change the world. That's not something that happens with a lack of drive or ambition. Reynolds seemed ready for the rebuttal. But there's a difference between demanding excellence and burning people out. Some of your employees have said they've felt like cogs in a machine, working around the clock with little regard for their well-being. How do you balance the need for productivity with the need for personal lives? Elon's expression hardened, just a bit. If you want to build something groundbreaking, you can't expect to do it in a 9-to-5 world. People have to understand that. But let me make one thing clear, the people who work at Tesla, SpaceX, or any of my companies, they're there because they believe in the mission. They're not being forced to work 100-hour weeks. They're doing it because they want to be part of something bigger than themselves. Mark seemed to sense the emotional weight of the response, but he wasn't going to let up. But can you really justify pushing your employees so hard? Is it worth it if they end up burned out or leaving the company? Elon met his gaze without hesitation. People leave companies all the time, Mark. That's part of the journey. Not everyone is cut out for this kind of work. The ones who stay? They're the ones who will change the world. It's not for everyone, but it's worth it for those who are ready to give everything for the future. The audience had been quiet up until this point, but now they were listening intently, captivated by the fierce back and forth between the host and the billionaire entrepreneur. This wasn't a simple interview, it was a philosophical debate, a discussion about the price of progress, the costs of innovation, and the human toll that comes with chasing monumental goals. Mark Reynolds finally paused, his expression thoughtful. He had been probing for weaknesses, trying to catch Musk off guard, but the more he pushed, the more he realized that Musk was unshaken, unwavering in his convictions. There was a certain raw honesty to Elon's answers that, whether one agreed with him or not, commanded respect. You really believe in all this, Reynolds said quietly, leaning back. You don't just see it as business. You see it as something bigger, something that transcends anything most people can even comprehend. Elon nodded slowly. Absolutely. This isn't just about making money or building successful companies. It's about creating a future that makes sense. One where we have a backup planet, where energy isn't a limitation, where we don't have to worry about fossil fuels running out. This is about ensuring humanity has a shot at surviving, thriving, for centuries to come. There was a silence, a long pause where both men looked at each other. Mark Reynolds seemed to be weighing Musk's words carefully. Then, as if the weight of the conversation had finally settled, Mark smiled. Well, I can't say I fully agree with you on everything, Elon, but I can see you have an unshakable drive. And I guess that's what makes you, well, you. Elon's expression softened, his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. Thanks, Mark. I think that's all any of us can hope for. The audience erupted into applause, but there was no doubt that the air had shifted. The conversation had gone from a typical interview to a deep, intellectual clash of ideologies, and it wasn't over yet. The applause was loud, but it felt like a distant hum in the back of Mark Reynolds' mind. He had just been caught in a whirlwind, a debate that not only tested his journalistic skills but also forced him to reassess the nature of innovation, ambition, and leadership. There was an intensity in the air that lingered, like a storm about to break. Elon Musk sat calmly, his arms resting on the armrests of his chair, eyes fixed on Reynolds. It was a look that made the host feel like he was both the interviewer and the interviewee. Despite the bravado of his earlier remarks, there was something deeply unnerving about Musk's unwavering composure. Mark had asked tough questions, but it felt like Elon had anticipated each one long before it was posed. "So, Elon," Mark began, trying to regain his footing, "you've made it clear that you're not here to play it safe. But there's something else that people want to know. You've had incredible success, but you've also had your fair share of failures. SpaceX's early rocket explosions, Tesla's near bankruptcy, and, of course, your infamous Twitter rants. How do you handle failure when the stakes are this high?" A flicker of something, was it a smile, crossed Elon's face. "Failure is part of the process. It's the only way to learn. I've had my share of failures. SpaceX was a joke in the beginning. Everyone thought we were insane. Tesla was on the brink of collapse for years. But those failures, those mistakes, are what pushed us to find better solutions." Mark leaned forward, his voice lowering. "But isn't there a point where failure stops being a lesson and starts becoming a pattern? People talk about your fail-fast mentality, but isn't there a danger in pushing that philosophy too far? At what point do you stop taking risks and start thinking about consequences?" Elon's eyes sharpened, his posture straightening slightly. "You learn from failure, but you also learn from taking risks. If you stop taking risks, you stop innovating. And that's the real danger, not pushing boundaries. If I thought about consequences all the time, we wouldn't have even tried to make a rocket that could land itself, or a car that could drive itself. No one else was going to do it." Reynolds took a moment to absorb Elon's response. There was no denying it, Musk's relentless pursuit of his vision was a force to be reckoned with. But there was something about his words that felt almost dangerous. Was it possible to be too committed? Too focused on the end result? Mark shook his head, feeling the weight of his next question. "So you believe that the end justifies the means? That no matter how many setbacks or criticisms, the final goal is worth it?" Elon's gaze never wavered. "I wouldn't say the end justifies the means. What I'm saying is that the process of getting there, the journey, is what matters. We've made mistakes, of course. But we've also changed the world. And that's the difference between being remembered for doing something truly innovative and being remembered for playing it safe." For the first time during their exchange, Mark Reynolds hesitated. It was clear that this conversation was evolving in ways he hadn't expected. There were moments when he felt he was challenging Musk's philosophies, yet there was another part of him that found himself on the verge of understanding. This wasn't just about Musk's public persona, it was about something deeper, something that stretched beyond the headlines. But before Mark could formulate his next question, something shifted. The studio doors opened, and the producer signaled to him that they were approaching a commercial break. Mark nodded, briefly glancing at the camera as the crew began moving in and out of position. "All right, folks, we'll be right back with more from Elon Musk, the man who's reshaping the future, whether you like it or not. Don't go anywhere." The commercial break was a welcome pause, but even as the host stepped off the stage for a few minutes, his mind was racing. There was so much more he wanted to ask Elon, but each question seemed to lead into another. Musk had expertly deflected his attempts to challenge his motives and leadership style, turning each jab into a philosophical lesson on the nature of risk, failure, and success. Mark could sense that this was no longer just an interview. It had become something else, a confrontation of ideologies. A battle for perspective. During the break, Mark took a deep breath and spoke with his team. He couldn't afford to lose the edge now, not after everything that had happened. The interview had shifted, and the stakes were higher than ever. There was no room for softballs. He needed to push harder, find the cracks that Elon was so carefully hiding. As the crew prepped for the next segment, Mark returned to his seat, his expression more determined than before. The cameras clicked on, and the show resumed. "All right, we're back," Mark announced with a slight smile. "Let's dive a little deeper, Elon. You've spoken about your failures, your triumphs, your unwavering belief in the future. But here's a question I'm sure many are asking: do you ever think about the toll it takes on your personal life? You've been married multiple times, had very public relationships, and your personal life has often made as many headlines as your company's. How do you balance this high-octane life with the people you care about?" Elon didn't flinch. The question was fair, but one that he had deftly avoided in the past. Still, his answer was as precise as ever. "Balance is a myth. At least, in my world. You can't be all things to all people. I've made mistakes in my personal life, sure. But everything I do, the companies, the projects, the vision, it's all connected. The people around me understand that." Mark nodded, sensing that Elon was going to skirt around the deeper emotional truth of the question. But he wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. "And yet, some people say that your drive for success has come at the expense of your relationships. Is it worth it? Sacrificing the personal for the professional?" Elon's expression softened slightly, though his voice remained steady. "I've made choices. It's not about sacrifice. It's about commitment to a larger cause. I'm not the kind of person who's interested in living a quiet, conventional life. And those who are close to me understand that. But it's not easy." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, there was a glimpse of vulnerability in Musk's response. It wasn't much, just a brief crack in the armor, but it was enough for Mark to realize that, despite all of Elon's confidence and control, there were still moments when the weight of his decisions hit home. It wasn't over yet. The battle of words had only just begun. The interview had reached a critical point. Mark Reynolds could feel the shift in the energy. Elon Musk, usually so calculated, was starting to show cracks, a slight shift in the impervious shell he'd built over years of public scrutiny. Mark knew this was his moment, this was where the real story would come out. He could feel it in the air, like the calm before a storm. The cameras rolled, the audience's eyes were fixed on them, and for a brief second, it felt as though everything had come to a halt. Elon sat there, calm as ever, but Mark could see the tension building beneath the surface. Mark decided to push a little further. He had to. "So, Elon," he began, his voice smooth but carrying an edge, "you've been known to make some bold decisions. Buying Twitter, for instance. A move that shocked many people. Some saw it as genius, others as reckless. What was your reasoning behind it? What made you think that taking over one of the most influential social platforms in the world was a good idea?" The question was sharp, cutting right to the heart of the matter. It was something that had fascinated the public since the announcement, and it had been the subject of endless debates. Mark knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, but he was prepared. Elon leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced in front of him, but his expression remained unreadable. "I believe free speech is under attack, especially in the digital age. Twitter is one of the last places where people can express themselves openly, and I wanted to ensure that it remains a platform where diverse voices, regardless of their views, can be heard." Mark nodded slowly. "That sounds noble, but many critics argue that the way you've handled the platform has, at times, undermined that very principle. You've banned accounts, suspended journalists, and even shared controversial opinions that some say are damaging to the discourse. Do you think you're walking a fine line between upholding free speech and controlling the narrative? Elon's eyes narrowed slightly. It was clear that the topic of Twitter was something he felt deeply about, but it was also something that carried a great deal of risk. The pressure was building. I don't control the narrative, Mark. I'm trying to bring balance to it. The issue is not with free speech, it's with the censorship that's been happening for years. The people who claim to be for free speech often end up silencing voices they disagree with. Twitter is about ensuring that everyone has the right to speak, regardless of whether or not their opinions align with mine. Mark could sense the tension in the air, the push and pull between his desire to ask tough questions and Elon's insistence on steering the conversation toward his own vision. But Mark wasn't backing down. He couldn't. The storm had already begun to gather. And yet, Mark pressed, some people feel that your influence over the platform has led to a rise in misinformation, hate speech, and even harassment. Do you think it's possible to promote free speech without allowing harmful content to flourish? Where do you draw the line? Elon's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. There's always a balance to be struck. But I believe people should have the freedom to make up their own minds. Misinformation is a problem, but censoring ideas and opinions doesn't solve it, it only suppresses them. The real solution is not to restrict speech, but to encourage critical thinking and open dialogue. Mark's expression hardened. But at what cost, Elon? Can we really afford to let harmful rhetoric spread unchecked? Some might say that your approach to free speech puts people's safety and well-being at risk. Do you think that's worth it? For a moment, Elon didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. And then, when he finally spoke, his words were measured, but full of conviction. People have always been afraid of change, he said slowly. When the printing press was invented, people were terrified of the power it gave individuals. When the internet became mainstream, people feared the rise of new ideas. Every great advancement comes with risks. But that's the price of progress. If we start controlling the flow of ideas, we risk losing the very thing that makes society great, its ability to evolve. Mark couldn't deny the logic in Elon's words. There was a certain radical honesty to his stance, something that was undeniably compelling, even if he didn't fully agree with it. But that was the nature of the conversation. They weren't here to agree, they were here to challenge, to push, and to make sense of it all. And what about the personal toll this has taken on you? Mark asked, a bit softer this time. You've dealt with a lot of public criticism, especially since taking over Twitter. You've faced backlash from all sides. How do you handle that kind of pressure? Does it affect you? For the first time during the interview, Elon paused. His expression didn't change, but there was a slight shift in his demeanor. It was almost imperceptible, but Mark could see it. A flicker of something, a weariness, perhaps, or maybe a realization that, in the end, even the most ambitious visionary wasn't immune to the weight of their decisions. I won't lie, Elon said, his voice quieter now. It's tough. But I've never done any of this for popularity. I'm not here to be liked, I'm here to make a difference. And sometimes, that means facing criticism. But if I let that stop me, nothing would ever change. So, I just keep moving forward. Mark nodded, his mind racing with the complexity of the conversation. This wasn't just about business or innovation, it was about the price of ambition, the personal sacrifices made in the pursuit of something greater. The storm was no longer on the horizon, it had arrived. The conversation had reached its emotional peak. Elon Musk, the man who had revolutionized industries and changed the course of history, was now laying bare the personal and professional costs of his relentless drive. And as the audience sat in stunned silence, Mark knew that the impact of this interview would echo far beyond the studio walls. The storm didn't just stop there, it intensified. Elon Musk's words were powerful, but there was an underlying tension in his voice, something raw that he rarely showed. It was like he had reached a point in this interview where the stakes had shifted. It was no longer just a conversation between a tech mogul and a host, it was a battle for understanding the cost of ambition, the price of progress, and the emotional toll of trying to reshape the world. Mark Reynolds had gone from interviewing Musk to wrestling with him, figuratively speaking. Every question now felt more like a challenge, a way to get to the heart of the man who was changing the world. And yet, there was something more at play here. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were tapping into something profound. The tension in the air was palpable as the cameras continued to roll, the audience hanging on every word. "Let's pivot for a moment, Elon," Mark said, his voice steadier now. "You've talked about your vision, about changing the world, but the question that keeps coming up for many people is this: at what point do you stop, and when do you say, enough is enough? There's no doubt that you've revolutionized space, transportation, and the digital landscape, but do you ever think about what happens after all of these goals are met?" Elon's eyes narrowed, and Mark could see the wheels turning in his mind. It was a question that hadn't been asked before, at least, not like this. The idea that Musk might ever step back, pause, or reconsider his relentless drive was almost unimaginable. But the question had to be asked. "That's a good question, Mark," Elon said slowly, his voice thoughtful. "But I don't think of it in terms of, when do I stop? For me, it's more about, what else can we do? What are the next frontiers? We've barely scratched the surface of what's possible. But doesn't that thinking come with risks?" Mark pressed. "What happens when the world you're trying to create isn't what you expected? What if the very innovations you're pushing forward start to do more harm than good?" Elon's gaze shifted, the fire in his eyes reigniting. "You can't create change without risk. If we hadn't pushed the boundaries, we wouldn't have electric cars, we wouldn't be talking about Mars as a possible destination. Sure, there's risk, but the alternative is stagnation. And stagnation is death. The world needs bold ideas, even if they come with the possibility of failure." Mark didn't back down. "But isn't there a line, Elon? Isn't there a point where innovation goes too far? The world is complicated, there are unintended consequences. What happens when those consequences come back to bite you?" Elon's expression remained intense, but his voice softened just a fraction. "I understand the risks. But I can't sit back and let those risks prevent us from moving forward. If we don't push for change, if we don't challenge the status quo, we're just treading water. And if the consequences are harsh, then we face them. But the world needs innovation more than it needs comfort. The key is balancing the two." Mark took a deep breath, realizing that the line between criticism and understanding was razor-thin here. Musk wasn't simply a man with a vision, he was a man who saw himself as the agent of change, one whose drive to make the world a better place was his compass, no matter the cost. "But, Elon," Mark said, his voice quieter now, "isn't there a point where personal responsibility comes into play? You've got the power to influence millions of people. Your companies, your voice, they all have an impact. How do you handle the weight of that responsibility, knowing that people are looking to you to lead?" The room seemed to quiet even further as the question hung in the air. The audience, usually so accustomed to Musk's sharp wit and confident answers, was now hanging on every word. The stakes had shifted from business to something much deeper, something more human. Elon leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused, almost as if he was looking inward before responding. "I understand the responsibility. Believe me, I do. But at the end of the day, I'm just a man with a vision. I can't carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. What I can do is try to push humanity forward, to take those risks that others won't. But I can't be everything to everyone. I can't be the moral compass for the entire world. People have to take responsibility for their own lives, too." Mark nodded slowly, letting Elon's words sink in. There was a hard truth in what he said. Musk wasn't trying to be a savior, he was trying to be a catalyst for something greater. But was that enough? Could one person truly change the world, or was there a point where their actions became too far-reaching, too unchecked? I get it, Mark said after a pause. But here's the thing, Elon, at what point does the individual become part of something greater than themselves? You can't always control the outcome of your decisions. At some point, the collective has to take priority over the individual, right? Elon's expression shifted slightly, the faintest sign of contemplation flickering in his eyes. Maybe. But I think you're underestimating the power of the individual. Change doesn't come from committees or consensus, it comes from people who are willing to take risks, to challenge the norms. If we wait for everyone to agree, we'll never move forward. It's the dreamers and the doers who push society forward. Mark leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about Elon Musk anymore, it was about a fundamental question that had plagued society for generations. Can one person change the world, or are we all merely products of the systems we exist within? The audience was still, hanging on every word, sensing the shift in the tone of the interview. It was no longer just about technology or business, it was about the very nature of leadership and ambition. Elon Musk, for all his genius and flaws, had created a legacy that would be remembered for generations. But at what cost? The question loomed larger than ever. The cameras clicked off for a moment, and Mark took a breath, staring across the table at Musk, who was deep in thought. And for the first time in the interview, Mark couldn't help but wonder, was Elon Musk the hero he made himself out to be, or was he a man who simply believed that his vision was the only way forward, no matter the consequences? The storm hadn't passed. It was only just beginning. The tension in the room was thick. The audience was hanging on every word, waiting for the next shift in the conversation. Mark Reynolds knew he had one final question left, the question that would either make or break this interview, the question that would reveal everything. The stakes were higher now than ever before. He had pushed Elon Musk to the edge, now, it was time to see what lay beneath. Mark leaned forward, locking eyes with Elon, his voice steady, yet brimming with anticipation. Elon, let's talk about the future. The future you see for humanity. You've spoken about Mars, artificial intelligence, and even creating a sustainable world for generations to come. But with all the advancements you've made, there's a growing fear that we might be heading into unknown territory, territory that could bring unintended consequences. People are asking, are we truly ready for all of this? Are we heading into a future we can control, or one that's already out of our hands? The question seemed to hang in the air, carrying with it the weight of all the fears, hopes, and uncertainties that had come up in the conversation. Elon's face remained stoic, but for the first time in this interview, Mark saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. The armor was starting to crack. Elon took a deep breath before answering. Look, I understand the fears. People are afraid of what they don't understand. And I get it, space exploration, renewable energy, they're all enormous leaps. But they're also necessary. Humanity has always been about pushing boundaries. From the moment we figured out fire to the moment we landed on the moon, we've been moving forward, sometimes at a terrifying pace. But if we don't continue to move forward, we stagnate. And stagnation, as I've said before, is the true enemy. Mark could see the passion in Elon's words, the belief that every risk he took was justified by the potential rewards. But there was something else there, something that couldn't be ignored. A sense of responsibility, maybe even fear, hidden behind the determination. But what if, Mark pushed, the cost of that progress is something we can't come back from? What if we push too hard, too fast? What happens when the very technologies we've created to solve problems start causing them? We've seen it with social media, AI, even the climate crisis. There's this idea that technology is always the answer, but is it really? Or are we chasing something that's slipping out of our grasp? Elon's gaze softened, and for the first time in this interview, he looked human. The mask of the genius visionary, the unshakable force of nature, seemed to slip away, revealing a man who carried more than just the weight of his companies on his shoulders. He carried the future of humanity, too. I won't lie, Mark. There are risks. Big ones. But I truly believe that we need to face those risks head-on if we want a future for humanity. Look, I'm not a prophet, and I don't have all the answers. But what I do know is this: if we sit back and wait for the perfect solution, we'll never get there. We'll never leave Earth, we'll never conquer the energy crisis, and we'll never see a better future. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. There was an honesty there, a rawness that hadn't been present before. Elon Musk wasn't just defending his vision, he was grappling with the very real uncertainties of his path, the ones that kept him up at night. Mark didn't know what to say. The lines between right and wrong, between ambition and responsibility, were beginning to blur. And in that moment, it became clear, Elon Musk wasn't just building a legacy, he was building the future, for better or worse. And what about you, Elon? Mark asked quietly, as if testing the waters. What happens when you've done everything you've set out to do? When you've made your mark on history, what's left for you? What's the personal cost of all of this? Elon's gaze drifted away for a moment, as though lost in thought. The question seemed to cut deeper than Mark had intended. For all the business deals, the billions in investments, and the grand ideas, Elon Musk was still just a man. A man who had sacrificed so much to get to where he was. A man who, perhaps, had to sacrifice a part of himself to chase his vision. I don't really think about that, Elon said finally, his voice softer than before. I don't think about legacy or fame or fortune. Those are byproducts of what we're doing. I think about what comes next, what's beyond this moment. The future. The future is all that matters to me. Mark nodded, feeling the weight of the conversation sink in. It wasn't just about innovation. It wasn't just about breaking barriers. It was about leaving something behind, something that would endure long after Elon Musk had moved on to the next frontier. But at what cost? And would the future he was building truly be one that everyone could live in? The room fell into a quiet moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark knew that this interview had gone beyond the surface of a simple discussion about tech or business. It had become a reflection on the very nature of progress, humanity's drive to conquer the unknown, and the sacrifices made along the way. And yet, Mark said, his voice steady but filled with gravity, the question still remains. Will all of this be enough? Will the future that you're building be one that we can all live in? Or is it a future that only a few will be able to survive in? Will you be the architect of a new world, or will you be its sole inhabitant, with everyone else left behind? Elon didn't answer immediately. His gaze flickered across the room, as if weighing Mark's words. The silence seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, Elon spoke. That's the challenge, Mark, he said, his voice quieter now, more reflective. That's the question we all need to ask ourselves. And it's one that no one can answer alone. The words hung in the air like a question with no easy answer. And in that moment, the audience realized that the interview had shifted yet again. It was no longer about Elon Musk, the entrepreneur or the visionary. It was about the cost of progress, the price of ambition, and the unknown future that lay ahead. As the cameras powered down, Mark Reynolds sat back in his chair, taking in the gravity of what had just transpired. Elon Musk had given him more than he had bargained for. And as he reflected on the conversation, he realized that the story of Elon Musk was far from over, it was still unfolding, one bold decision at a time. The interview had ended, but the conversation wasn't over. The cameras were off, the lights dimmed, and the bustling studio that had once been filled with tension was now eerily quiet. Mark Reynolds sat at the table, still processing the weight of what had just transpired. Elon Musk had said more than anyone had expected, revealing a side of himself few had seen before, vulnerable, human, and, in some ways, uncertain. But that uncertainty wasn't weakness, it was a glimpse into the complexity of being a leader of Musk's caliber. A man who was both a visionary and a man aware of the enormous costs of the journey he was on. But outside the studio, the ripple effect had already begun. Within minutes, social media erupted. Clips of the interview were shared across every platform, with people dissecting every word Elon had spoken, speculating on what it all meant for the future. The headlines weren't just about Musk's ambitions anymore. They were about his humanity. About his fears, his reflections, and his acknowledgement of the risks he faced. In every corner of the internet, the discussion was underway: is Elon Musk the hero we need, or is he too much of a risk? Can one man shape the future, or will his vision destroy us all? As Mark made his way out of the studio, he couldn't escape the feeling that this interview had opened a door. A door to something bigger than just a tech mogul or a billionaire businessman. The public was no longer just interested in Musk's products, they were interested in the man behind them. They were questioning whether his extraordinary ambitions were truly in line with humanity's best interests. Mark couldn't help but reflect on how Elon had responded to his final question. There was a certain honesty in Elon's reply, an acknowledgement that no one, not even him, had all the answers. Musk had always been known for his confidence, but there, in that moment, he had shared a vulnerability that spoke volumes. It was almost as if, for the first time, Musk had come face to face with the true cost of his drive, something even he had to reckon with. The world was watching now, and the questions only grew louder. The days that followed were a blur for both Elon and Mark. The interview's impact reverberated across the globe. News outlets, political commentators, tech bloggers, and even casual social media users all had something to say about it. But the real conversation wasn't happening in boardrooms or in front of cameras, it was happening in living rooms, coffee shops, and across dinner tables. People were no longer just talking about Elon Musk's ventures, they were talking about the price of progress. About what it meant to be constantly pushing forward without fully understanding where that push would take us. And for Elon Musk, that was the hardest part. One evening, as Elon sat alone in his office at SpaceX, staring out at the endless expanse of stars above the Earth, his thoughts wandered. He wasn't used to self-doubt, but it had crept in slowly, quietly, like a shadow he couldn't shake. The question Mark had asked, at what point does the individual become part of something greater than themselves? Echoed in his mind. Elon had always seen himself as someone who would lead humanity to the stars, but had he underestimated the impact of his actions? The cost of pushing the boundaries of innovation, to the point where the world's very fabric was being stretched? His mind raced, caught between his unwavering belief in his mission and the nagging concern that he might be too far ahead of the rest of the world. Was the world truly ready for what he was bringing? Or was he dragging humanity into a future they weren't prepared for? As much as Elon tried to dismiss the question, it lingered. He knew that to make progress, he couldn't wait for consensus. That wasn't how change happened. But change came with consequences, and some of those consequences were now painfully clear. Was he ready to face them? Back in the studio, Mark was processing his own revelations. He had asked questions that pushed Elon to his limits, but it wasn't until after the interview that he fully realized the depth of the conversation. This wasn't just about a tech mogul or the next big company, it was about something far larger. A future that was still unfolding, with no clear destination in sight. Mark's phone buzzed with a notification. His interview had gone viral, but it wasn't the viral fame that he was concerned about. It was the conversations taking place all over the world, people trying to understand the man they had seen on screen. Who was Elon Musk, really? Was he a visionary leading the way to the future, or was he a man who might have pushed too far? And what did all of this mean for the future of technology, humanity, and society as a whole? Mark knew this interview would go down as one of the most talked about moments of his career. But what he didn't know was whether the questions Musk had raised would lead to answers or only more uncertainty. Meanwhile, Elon stood in front of a whiteboard in his office, scribbling out new ideas and possibilities. Space travel. Renewable energy. Artificial intelligence. They were all interconnected, one piece of a massive puzzle. But the path ahead was no longer just about the next breakthrough, it was about the responsibility that came with it. What if he couldn't control everything? What if humanity wasn't ready? What if, after all these years, he was just a man with a big dream, trying to change the world in ways it wasn't prepared for? His phone buzzed with a message from one of his advisors, the media storm's getting bigger. They're asking more personal questions now. Are you ready for this? Elon sighed, running a hand through his hair. Was he ready? He'd never questioned his own readiness before. But now, the very foundation of his ambition felt a little shakier. He looked out the window, the stars seeming to flicker back at him like a challenge. In that moment, Elon Musk understood that progress was never a straight line. It was a series of twists, turns, and crossroads, some that led to greatness, and others that led to lessons learned the hard way. And the real question wasn't whether he was ready. It was whether humanity was ready for the change he was creating. The weeks following the interview had been a whirlwind. The world was still processing Elon Musk's words, the revelations, and the quiet, almost introspective side he had revealed during that conversation. Public opinion about him had shifted. People had always seen him as a bold, driven entrepreneur, someone who was always a step ahead of the world. But now, they saw a man caught between his immense ambition and the weight of the consequences of his actions. Elon Musk, the visionary, had become something more complex, a man torn between the extraordinary future he envisioned and the profound risks that came with it. Back in the studio, Mark Reynolds had watched the aftermath unfold with fascination. The interview, which had started as a standard Q&A with one of the world's most famous billionaires, had become something deeper. Something more personal. Mark realized that his questions had not only revealed Elon's ideas for the future of humanity, they had exposed a vulnerability that spoke to a much larger narrative. Elon sat in a meeting room at Tesla, surrounded by engineers and strategists. The air was thick with discussions about the next steps for the company, as they prepared for the launch of a new electric vehicle. The stakes were higher than ever. Tesla had moved beyond being just an electric car company. It was a symbol of the future. But as Elon listened to the team debate the latest technological innovations, his mind kept drifting back to the interview. The questions Mark had asked had opened a door he hadn't expected to walk through. The responsibility he felt, toward the world, toward his companies, and most importantly, toward humanity, had grown exponentially. He had always known that his ambitions were risky. Mars. Artificial intelligence. Reversing climate change. These weren't just projects, they were the backbone of a future that would either be incredible or catastrophic. But what if he was missing something? What if the world wasn't ready for all of this? Mr. Musk, one of the engineers asked, snapping him out of his thoughts. We need your input on the design specifications for the new car's battery. Are we on track? Elon nodded, his focus snapping back to the present. Yes. We're on track. Make sure we keep pushing the envelope on efficiency. We're not just building cars, we're building the future. Don't forget that. The team nodded, knowing that Elon's passion was what fueled their innovation. But even as he spoke the words, he felt a gnawing uncertainty in the pit of his stomach. His ambitions were unrelenting, but there was something about this moment, this pause in the middle of an overwhelming journey, that made him question if it was all worth it. Outside of his companies, Elon's personal life had also become a subject of public curiosity. The media wanted to know about his relationships, his family, and whether he could balance his immense drive with the need for personal connection. It was a question that had been asked for years, but now it had a sharper edge. Could one man truly balance the weight of a global vision and still have the ability to connect with the people he cared about? Elon had always been fiercely independent, but even he couldn't deny that some of the personal costs were starting to mount. His children. His closest friends. The people who had been with him since the early days of Zip2 and PayPal, had he left them behind in the pursuit of his dream? That question lingered, unanswered, even as he stood on the precipice of transforming humanity's future. One evening, Elon took a rare moment to himself. He sat in a small cafe in Palo Alto, watching the sunset over the horizon. It was a moment of solitude that he had not experienced in a long time. For once, he wasn't thinking about rockets or electric cars or artificial intelligence. He wasn't thinking about the next big step, the next breakthrough. He was just being. As he sat there, he reflected on everything he had built, the companies, the technology, the dreams. But now, for the first time, he also reflected on what he had sacrificed. And what he stood to lose. The future he envisioned was coming closer with each passing day. But what would the world look like when that future arrived? Would people thank him for his efforts? Would they see him as a hero who had saved humanity from the brink? Or would they blame him for pushing too hard, too fast, into the unknown? A message from one of his advisors broke him from his thoughts. The board is asking for an update on the Mars mission. They want to know when the first crewed flight will be. Elon chuckled to himself. The mission, the dream, always pulling him forward. It never stopped. Even in moments like this, when he was alone with his thoughts, the future was never far away. A few days later, Elon gave an impromptu interview to a group of young engineers and scientists who had come to visit SpaceX's headquarters. The group was filled with hopeful faces, all eager to work on the projects that had captured the world's imagination. They wanted to build rockets, create sustainable energy solutions, and be part of the future that Elon had laid out before them. The room was filled with excitement, but as Elon spoke, he found himself reflecting on his earlier doubts. I want you to remember something, he said, his voice steady but with a quiet weight to it. We're not just building technology here. We're building a future. A future that will outlive us all. That means we have to get it right, no matter the cost. Sometimes, the things that are worth doing the most are the hardest to accomplish. The young faces in the room nodded in agreement, but there was a subtle shift in their expressions. They understood the gravity of his words, and for the first time, they saw Elon not just as a leader, but as someone who understood the immense weight of the legacy they were all part of creating. As the session ended, Elon lingered in the room, watching the young engineers as they discussed their projects. He felt a sense of pride. This was his legacy. But it was also a reminder of what he had to lose. The future was a fragile thing, and while he had the power to shape it, he also had the power to destroy it. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his office, Elon watched the news reports of the interview again. The words Mark had asked him were still fresh in his mind. What happens when you've done everything you've set out to do? When you've made your mark on history, what's left for you? It was a question that had lingered long after the cameras had stopped rolling. What was left for him? What happened when he reached the top of the mountain he had spent his life climbing? Elon didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he knew this, his work was far from over. Whether or not the world was ready for his vision, whether or not the cost was too great, he would continue, as he always had. For better or for worse, the future was coming. And Elon Musk would be its architect.